Good afternoon, everybody. Is everybody okay? I feel like I hate being behind these things because I feel like I haven't got any legs and nobody can see them. Maybe if I just stand here, it's better. Right? Move that round. Okay. Hello. Obviously, I was here this morning, so I'm Natalie. So my actually sort of looking more at what I do. So I helped to set up the Christian Feminist Network, but my work, I'm an independent consultant and I work on addressing violence against women and wider sort of gender injustice. Over the last kind of year, I've started to do a lot more on gender, and I've stopped calling it equality because people think equality is something that you can sort of take or leave, but actually justice is it's not really an option to ignore injustice, is it? So, and I've also written a youth domestic abuse education programme called DAY, and I train professionals across the UK to run that with young people. And I've done quite a lot of work with churches on addressing violence against women, specifically domestic abuse. So, and I also set up a campaign about the 50 Shades books, about them actually being very abusive. So you can always check that out if you want to know more about that. So there's the websites for that. So I thought I'd start by a discussion on this statement. So combating racism is about moving beyond seeing people as black, white, Asian and seeing people as equal. Similarly, addressing sexism is about getting to the point where we don't see men or women, we just see people. So have a discussion maybe in twos or threes about whether you agree with that statement or what you think about it. Yeah, I would agree. I think for me, it's not a statement I agree with. I didn't quote it from anywhere. I made it up. But I think it's one that it's one that a lot of people think the fight for equality is about. So a lot of people, when they're like, oh, I'm not interested in feminism, I'm not interested in equality, or, equality is just a way of sort of making everybody the same, sort of creating a uniformity. It's not, and I think it's a lot, I think this is quite useful because people do think, sort of that, I'm colourblind. Are you really? And it sort of denies the reality of that people start at different points and that we can't treat everybody, that treating people the same, like you said, especially if somebody has a disability, that's a physical way that they may be unable to contribute in the same way as someone else. And so we do have to put other things in place in a very practical way. And actually, it's the same with any form of inequality, isn't there? There's different actions and things that need to take place to make that change. Okay, so this is a quote that is the best quote that I've really come about that illustrates this. It's from a man in the US, and he says, "Privilege is a difficult notion to fully grasp, but necessary to critically understand the world and dismantle oppression. Understanding one's own privilege means locating one's positionality in society. The fact that I am a white, middle-class, heterosexual American male without a physical or cognitive disability doesn't just make me lucky. Privilege is more than starting the race in the inside lane. Due to the oppressive nature of global power relations, I have systematic advantages over other individuals and other groups." Not only did other folks have to start in the outside lane, but throughout the race they have to deal with hurdles, potholes and people squirting Gatorade, which is Lucozade if you're not American, on them. The colour of my skin and the fact that I have middle-class parents and a penis has a dramatic effect on my life. Our society teaches us not to recognise our privilege and to deny its existence. But without this realisation, which can be frustrating, painful and challenging to our core beliefs, we will have a false understanding of history, reality and the potential for change. And I think I was just kind of Googling a few, when I wrote this session about, privilege coming off, and I think it's a really powerful example. And I did this session, some of this session for trainee vicars, a day's training on gender awareness. And when I read this story, one of the ordinands came up to me and kind of said, "But don't you think really that women should get out of our lane?" was his actual statement to me. And I kind of went, well, maybe you should get out of your lane and make some room for somebody else. But it is that was, for me, I just was like, that totally exemplifies what we're dealing with here. And somebody else actually came up to me and he said, the thing is that there's more women in this room, and there was about 280 people in the room, and 2/3 of that room were male. And he went, there's more women in the room. And I went, there are not more women in the room. And he went, no, there are more women here. I went, there are not more women here. And this man genuinely couldn't tell that there were more women, that there were more men in the room. He just could not identify that because to him, actually, to have a room of church leaders where 1/3 of the room were women is more than he'd been used to. And so in most contexts, that's quite, hello, everybody that's just arrived. And so actually, this other man who was quite aggressive, so this guy just kind of started shouting at me in the session, going, "Where are you going with this session? I just don't know where you're going," because I had the audacity to say there was something wrong with John Eldridge, which is. John Eldridge wrote a book called Wild at Heart, which kind of says that men need an adventure. They have a wound. They need an adventure. They have a battle to fight and a beauty to rescue, and that's a biblical concept, don't you know? Anyway, so I'd kind of been saying that it's all nonsense. There's a woman's version called Captivated for the woman in your life who needs to be rescued, obviously, and needs to feel beautiful. Anyway, so this man was just like, "Where are you going with this?" And I was kind of like, "Well, if you'd let me talk, I might be able to tell you where I'm going to go." And so there is this sort of sense among men, but well, not all men, but among kind of, that sort of invisibility of privilege. And it kind of really beautifully illustrates Michael Kimmel's quote, which is that privilege is invisible to those with it. And Michael Kimmel is a gender theorist and has done some amazing work over the decades around kind of gender. And over the last few years, I've been on a bit of a journey regarding oppression and privilege. I grew up in a Christian family with a stay-at-home mum and a dad who owned a music shop. We didn't have a massive amount of money. At 17, I met my ex-husband, and he abused me for 4 years until I escaped when he assaulted me, and my second child was born 3 months premature. And I then became a young single parent living on income support in Gateshead, when they had money for people who were poor. I don't think they do. You just die now, I think, in this country if you happen to be in an unfortunate position. And then the Daily Mail tell you it's all your own fault, really, anyway. And so I kind of thought I got this idea of what oppression was because I'd been on the sort of receiving end of it. An amazing amount of miracles have happened between then and now, and I got remarried. I run a consultancy. My husband, I have a fantastic husband. He's been at home full time for the last 3 years so that I could gallivant around the country and wherever and do what I do, and he's looked after the children and the house. And in recovering from the abuse that I'd suffered, I discovered a massive amount of oppression. I found that domestic abuse is rooted in beliefs of ownership and entitlement. So ownership of. So my ex-husband believed that he owned me. And that belief of ownership led to a belief in entitlement, that he had the right to do what he did to me because he owns me. And it's really important that whenever we're responding to violence against women or abuse, that we understand that what we need to address is fundamentally ownership and entitlement. And it's one of the challenges is that it's fundamentally a feminist struggle, the one to address violence against women. But actually, the world would have us believe that it's about addressing alcohol issues. It's about addressing low self-esteem or anger management, and actually it's rooted in ownership and entitlement. And you've only got to look, you don't have to look very far in the church, do you, to see those beliefs of ownership and entitlement being perpetuated. Shall we just look at the marriage ceremony, for instance? Who gives this woman to marry this man? Oh, the person who owns her. And so obviously not in the Methodist Church, Dave. I mean, and it is, for me, when me and my husband got married, the good one, we chose to, both my parents stood up and said, we do. And when and then we said, and who gives this man to marry this woman? And actually his parents stood up. And so I think, actually you can reclaim some of that stuff. But also we're facing even broader senses of inequality in the different people's experiences of not even being able to get married currently as well. So, but yeah, and I found that I'm going to have to move up here for this bit. That actually it was rooted in patriarchy. That oppression of women is rooted in patriarchy, and that domestic abuse and everyday sexism, that women's lack of representation in public life, that rape, female genital mutilation, forced marriage, the pinkification of little girls and the squashing of little boys' tears, the exploitation of women through trafficking, videoed and photographed rape that's also known as pornography. And the fact that even though thousands upon thousands of people have signed a petition to remove a naked girl from the UK's biggest newspaper, there's still a young woman on page 3 every day, and that all of these things are underpinned by patriarchy. And I think there is this real sense of not joining the dots, that there's people responding to trafficking over there, and then there's people responding to domestic abuse over here, but it's very difficult sort of politically to get any sort of joined up realisation that these things are all contributory factors, but actually we're talking about patriarchy. And I discovered that, for me as a Christian, patriarchy can be understood as a principality and power, and that when we talk about not fighting flesh and blood, it is about fighting the powers and principalities of this dark world. And Ashley Judd, the actress, wrote a really excellent essay, and in that she says, patriarchy is not men. Patriarchy is a system in which both men and women participate. And if we look in the Bible, in Genesis 3:16, it says, your desire will be for your husband and he will rule over you. And that actually patriarchy is a primary consequence of the fall. And that when we started looking at, when we look at patriarchy, there's kind of the church has kind of said, oh, well, it was kind of ordained that men should rule over women, that was something that was there after, before the fall, but it wasn't. Until the fall, there was no sort of hierarchy, there was no domination of one over another. And actually, for me as a Christian, that there's a prophetic work to be done, that if Jesus came and the consequences of sin and death are no more because of Jesus is coming to earth, living, dying and being resurrected, then actually as Christians we have a responsibility to live out a prophetic life of modelling what it means for patriarchy not to be the kind of dominant power in our relationships, in the way we live our lives. And I think that's really important that we recognise that. And so I kind of thought, oh yeah, I get this whole thing of oppression. I know what I'm doing here. And then I realised that I had a really long way to go. So the first thing was I contributed a chapter to a book called The Lightbulb Moment, which talks about when women became feminists. And I don't know if it talked about, I think there was men and there was different people who'd spoken about when they became feminists in this book. And I contributed a chapter, and I went and shared my chapter at the launch of this book, and which was really interesting because the start of the chapter says, I'm a Christian and love God with all my heart. And I was there thinking, do I just miss that bit out when I read in front of all these feminists, and are they all going to throw things at me? And actually they were amazing, and they were really supportive and really sort of positive about what I'd said. And I think, that there's the sisterhood can count for more than what faith we have and other things. Anyway, but I was in there, and there was this woman who is kind of middle class, I think, at university, and she just went, I just think we need to get to the point in society where sexism is treated in the same way by the media as racism. And this woman in the panel, who was from the Black Feminist organisation, kind of went, I'd like to stop you there, because actually there's a big problem with how racism is treated in the media, and we haven't really got that far on racism. And this girl just went, no, you don't understand, because racism's treated much, much better. We deal with it, it's really criticised. And sex, and then, and you're like, stop digging, stop it. So kind of watching this interaction and thinking about actually how those two things do get pitted. Oh, we've got much further on that when really we haven't. And then I was at a church home group, and we were sat round, and I was trying to be really good and talk about oppression, about having power, and how, we need to help those with less power. And what I really meant to say was, we all live in the UK, and because we all have access to a certain level of finances, of benefits, although the self-servitives would prefer we didn't have any benefits. But anyway, and so I've called them the self-servitives after seeing someone on Twitter refer to them in that manner, so I now call them the self-servitives also. And basically, I just kind of, instead of saying, that we all have access to a certain level of power, went, because we're all white here, and looked around and saw that there were 6 people in the room and 3 of them were black. And I just went all from different communities, and and I just suddenly, it was a really big lesson for me about how it's, on one level, that's sort of quote at the beginning is sort of often the journey we start out on when we start to look at oppression and start to look at inequality, is to thinking we need to get to a point where we're not judging people because of what they look like or because of our assumptions about those people. But actually what I'd done in that space was I had totally invalidated the experience and the reality and the lives of 3 of those people in that room, and had totally denied who they were just because I was trying to make a point about power. And and it was a real massive lesson for me about actually the problem is much bigger than patriarchy, and it's much bigger than one form of oppression. And actually, that although my experience of abuse was rooted in the fact that I'm female, but for someone who is female and black, their experience of oppression is going to look different to mine. And for somebody who is disabled and male, their experience of oppression is no less valid because they're male. And so we see that actually there's an intersection of oppression and privilege that the majority of us in society experience: oppression in some parts of our life and privilege in some parts of our life. And it's a term that's kind of become the feminist bingo, sort of if you're going to prove you're a real feminist, you just got to say intersectionality and you're in. But it is a really important word. It kind of is defined as, and this definition is from the font of all knowledge, which is Wikipedia. Cultural patterns of oppression are not only interrelated, but are bound together and influenced by the intersectional systems of society. And so one of the issues that I found when I started to look at how do you actually respond in an intersectional way is that there's really split opinions on how you actually respond to it, and what intersectionality means and how we respond. And so there's these long words that define these things. So some people say that there's look at this, look at all these long words. So some people say there's an anti-categorical complexity, so that actually the categories of oppression are by nature oppressive, so we've got to stop using them, which I don't think is particularly practical, because how do we actually talk about them if we're not allowed to talk about them because we're being oppressive by talking about them? It's a bit of a problem. So other people think that there's a intercategorical complexity, which says that without naming the existing oppressive constructs, we will fail to change anything. So if we can't talk about them or use them, we won't have any language with which to do anything. And then there's the kind of intra-categorical complexity, which says that it's sort of a mixture of the two, which is where I'm kind of going. But you can see, when people start talking about intersectionality, there's people with all these different schools of thought, and it suddenly becomes much more complicated than actually even intersectionality on its own is. And so, for the purposes of this, I'm going to talk about some of the categories, just because otherwise we won't really be able to talk very much about it, will we? And actually, I personally believe that there's a real power in naming things. And Rumpelstiltskin, the fairy tale of Rumpelstiltskin, is a really powerful kind of representative of that. That when the queen learnt the name of Rumpelstiltskin, he lost his power over her. And there's something about that fairy tale which says something to us about that when we name things, they lose some of their power over us. And so I've got my own version of top trumps. It's called Privilege Trumps. And it is a way of exploring what the idea of privilege means to us and what our sort of experience of that is and how it works for us. And so I thought I'd start by looking at the privilege trumps card of somebody who clearly represents the average British person because he's the Prime Minister. So here we have David Cameron's top trumps card. So his gender's 10, race 10, sexual orientation, well, I don't know. I mean, from what we know, it's 10. Class 10, place of birth 10, education 10, age 10, because, middle-aged. Religion 10, in this community, in our context, religion is 10 to be sort of kind of, well, not an actual Christian, sort of somebody who professes to be kind of a Christian. I'm being really mean, aren't I? And then ethnicity, no, basically, ethnicity 10, ability 10, economic security 10. So that's... Okay, so then I thought I'd do my own top trumps card. So I'm kind of 5 for gender, race 10, sexual orientation 10, class about 4, so kind of from a working class background. And I mean, now I'd be considered middle class, but I hate the idea of being middle class. But no, I'm not. I'm still working class. I really am. Sort of place of birth, kind of the north. So sort of my age, like I'm in some places I'm 29, so some people would say being under 30 makes me really high, but then actually in terms of being taken seriously in society, it's sort of a bit lower. It depends what I want to do at my age, I suppose, depends on what score I give myself. So religion about 7, because I like to sort of practice the Jesus teaching, which in this country is a bit of a risk, but also it's not actually being a Muslim in this country is a much lower score, and it's treated much worse. Ethnicity 10, ability 10, and economic security about 6, because I'm a consultant and people don't always pay me. So, but compare, and it is, that the number you give yourself would be different. So if I was doing it in comparison with somebody living in sub-Saharan Africa, I'd be 10. On all of them in comparison, really. So it depends. But what I thought we could all do is do our own privilege trumps card. So I've got some here for you. So if you pass them round, you can draw a nice little picture of yourself and your name, and then you can score yourself. Now, it's up to you. If you don't want to score yourself or you don't feel comfortable doing that, feel free not to. But if you're able to, maybe fill in what you would see yourself as scoring, and there's no sort of wrong or right answer, there's no sort of scoring system, and then maybe talk to the people next to you about your experience of doing that and what your thoughts are on it. Okay, then we can all come back and let me know your thoughts. Are we ready to come back, everybody? When I did this with a group who were really passionate about anti-oppressive practice, kind of the non-violent communications, that sort of thing, they'd all done that, and I gave them this, and one woman was like, well, I gave myself my job as one because I had a high score and everything else, but my job's a low score. And what they all wanted was a really low score, and none of them had one because they wanted to identify with the oppressed. But they weren't. And it was so funny how when you start to sort of see it on paper, it feels quite uncomfortable. But it allows, I think, us to have a conversation on a different level than we often really are able to, because usually we avoid talking about this stuff because it's not very easy to have that conversation. So it can kind of cut through that. So maybe start at the back with the green hoodie brigade. Go on then. What were you talking about? Oh, it's an awful thought, isn't it? I feel terrible that my kids are going to grow up with an Essex accent. Not because I have anything with Essex, but I want them to be Northern. Yorkshire accent is the right accent. It is that sort of, what am I doing to them? What am I doing? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, well, it's stuff like accent, actually, that are being judged, in certain sort of societal, places. If we don't have sort of an Oxbridge accent, you can be judged very, very much for it. So it does depend on where you're coming from. So yeah, so brilliant. Did you have? So it's a difficult one, isn't it? It often depends on what we're comparing it to. What do we consider a low score, sort of thing. So some struggles with filling it. Yeah, and I think it is, that that almost if you totaled it up, not that it would always be very helpful to do so, we could think, oh, we're quite low on one, but it brings it up by in certain experience, some certain areas of life we have more. But you were saying some interesting stuff as well, weren't you, about your experiences as well? Yeah. So almost, although your ethnicity might be a certain, or race may be different, it may be one way, actually by having a daughter that's different, then actually there's a judgment there, isn't there? And yeah, it is interesting, and it's horrific, really, isn't it, that this is even a thing, really, in 2014, but it is. Did you have any thoughts at the back? Yeah, I think it's massive how the reality of this, how much we internalise it. So even if people don't treat us like this, or we don't, that our perception and maybe how we put ourselves out there or don't. I mean, I used to really struggle when I was a single parent with 2 children, and I most people don't think I'm old enough to have children now. So when I was like 21, I looked about 15, and I when I became a single parent, I had to constantly explain to everyone why I was a single parent, so they'd know that I worked really hard and I wasn't one of those single parents, and so there's this feeling of sort of constantly like everybody's judging me, which is partly accurate, but is often internalised as well. I know we've not got long, so I won't go through lots of my other things that I was going to talk about. But I think, there's a sense that often when we recognise our privilege, I think feeling convicted, I think for me it's the difference, it's the work of the Holy Spirit is to convict, not condemn, and that I know when I need to change something, if I feel convicted of it and feel quite positive about the idea of being changed and moving forward, whereas if I'm just like, I'm such a terrible person, I'm so awful, I think actually that's usually not God. That's usually, sort of feeling condemned isn't something that God wants to do, but feeling convicted to change, and how we enact that. And I think a lot of it is just being conscious of what this sort of exercise raises in us, and thinking about how can we take that forward in a positive way, really. Does anybody else have any thoughts? Any level of oppression? Yeah, and I think you're actually right. I think thanks for correcting that. And has anybody read Pedagogy of the Oppressed? Yeah, I've just I'm nearly finished reading it. Everyone was like, oh, it's a wonderful book. And then when I said I'd read 80 pages in a day, they were like, oh, I've never actually read it all. And I was like, if you haven't read it, it's very it just uses language that's really very difficult. It's not very accessible. But in that, he talks about how his name's Paulo Freire. And it's translated from Portuguese, so I think the translation doesn't help. And it was written about 40 years ago. But in it, he talks about the fact that actions to prevent the oppressor continuing to oppress are not oppressive. And that in our society, there is this temptation to kind of, when somebody's being oppressive and we take away their right to oppress, they start saying, I'm being oppressed. Now I'm the one on the receiving end of oppression. And it's not oppressive to stop somebody being oppressive. And I think that really was a really valuable thing to reflect on, because actually there's actions which are oppressive by the nature of privilege that in other people's hands and other people's using those same actions are not actually oppressive, because it's about the oppression and it's about the power and what is the so there's that sense, isn't there, that I think, kind of Christians calling themselves persecuted in the UK, that's kind of an example, isn't it, really, of this idea that, we're oppressed in the UK as Christians, which is absolute nonsense. But, and so it is that, it's an interesting thing to reflect on. Thanks for that. Any other thoughts? Yeah, financial security and having a lot of money means that it doesn't matter how many other issues there are, you can buy privilege, can't you? Yeah. But actually, I wonder whether there's still an experience of oppression within that, or I suppose looking at some of the most powerful sort of players in the music industry, and how somebody like Rihanna has a lot of money, but actually the sort of representation of her in the media is actually quite problematic, and so I suppose liberation is quite a different thing to having privilege, isn't it? That you can have a lot of privilege but not have much freedom, because if we consider freedom to be something of being free of sort of that, like Martin Luther King or Nelson Mandela, that when Nelson Mandela was locked up, he actually maintained a level of personal power that most of us struggle to ever access. And if I'd have had time, I don't think we've got much time, but just a quick picture to look at the difference between equality and justice. You may have seen this before, and it's really good, and just kind of saying, actually, we don't need to give everybody the same thing because the little person still can't see the game that they're playing. Is it cricket? I don't know, no, baseball, isn't it? Whereas, actually, on the other one, it's just thinking about, I was in a session before, and David, who was talking about men and masculinities, and he was saying, one guy was saying, I don't know what I think about this feminist thing because, they think that it's about because that 3-year-old's got a toy, the other 3-year-old wants it, and that's what he was likening sort of the fight for women's equality to. But it isn't, about us all having the same thing, but recognising that we need different things to get to the same place. Let me move through. Just looking at the ideal versus the reality that we see in Philemon, in that Paul kind of very clearly says to Philemon that you should, Onesimus, the slave, actually you should accept Onesimus as a brother, not as a slave, and gave this really radical, sort of quite manipulative, really, letter to this slave owner to say you should free the slave and treat them like a brother, but and did that in a very sort of gentle, softly way, while actually saying that there's neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free. And so there's this sense that Paul speaks this message of the ideal, that we realise this, but actually when dealing with a slave owner, he didn't sort of go, there's no slave and there's no free, Philemon. He kind of actually did this sort of real gently approach of taking him on a journey to actually that you should free this slave. And so just thinking about in our approach to addressing oppression, how we can have an ideal, but how do we take people on that journey in a way that's not going to switch them off at the first hurdle. Right, so then just before we finish. So just looking at a right use of power. So I went on this amazing training called the Right Use of Power training. If you type Right Use of Power Institute into Google, it comes up, and they're a US organisation, but I'm a trained facilitator. The actual fundamentals were really valuable. So they say there's 4 types of power. So there's personal power, which we have by virtue of being a human being, that you have personal power because you're a human being, and that gives us our access to a certain level of power. And as human beings, we all have access to the same level of personal power or we should have. Unfortunately, we don't. So personal power, human beings have it. The second thing is status power or privilege. So then this is where we start to have a problem, because people have different levels of power, and it's unjust that we have access to different levels of power in our status. And so there needs to be a separation of personal power and status power in terms of when we're looking at people. So we're not thinking that person is less valuable or more valuable. We're thinking that person has access, that as a human being they have access to a certain amount of power in that way, but also there's experience of oppression or privilege within that. And so then, this is a police officer. And so there's a role power. So as a police officer, she has an element of role power, which means that in her job as a police officer, she needs a different level of power, because she's got to sort of go in and deal with situations where there's somebody behaving in a way they shouldn't. And so she needs to have a level of power that comes with that role. And the problem we have in society is when people mix up their personal power and their role power and say, I'm a more important person, I'm more valuable because I am a police officer or because I'm the Prime Minister. And so it's that mixing up, a merging of I'm more important because I am, that means that we often feel quite uncomfortable about power differentials. Does that make sense? So I used to be really like, oh no, I don't have more power than anyone else. I'm just, oh no, I'm not that sort of person. No, we're all just equal here. But actually, if I'm managing a team, I need to take responsibility for what that means in that context.